Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for our panel. So this is the Laredo Project, Maine law students at the Texas border. My name is Sarah Cressy, and I'm a third-year student here at Maine Law and a student attorney in both the Refugee and Human Rights and Juvenile Justice clinics. I'm going to be moderating the panel this evening, and we're going to be talking about the Laredo Project, which is a collaboration between the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic and a project that is put on by Jones Day, the international law firm, and they do that in collaboration with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, which is a large nonprofit organization in Texas. So our panelists tonight are Anna Welch. Anna is the founder and director of the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, and along with her are Nora Bosworth, Joanne Batista, Katie Bressler, and Jeremy Williams. And each of them are my fellow third-year students and either current or former students in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic. So I'll actually ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves, and then I'll give a little bit more background about the project. So for the panelists, if you could each tell us your name, how long you've been working with the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, and when you traveled to Laredo.
My name is Nora Bosworth, and I was with the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic for 1 year, including a summer internship. And I traveled to Laredo for 1 week in the summer of 2017, and for another week in this last Christmas break in January 2008.
Hello again. My name is Joanne Bautista, and I've been with the clinic technically since first semester 1L year. I started off as an interpreter, and I like to joke that I got promoted to student attorney my second year, and so I've been with the clinic all 3 years. Oh, I'm sorry. And I was in Laredo in January. I apologize.
We'll give it that. I'm Katie Bressler. I'm a 3L. I'm from Colorado, and I worked in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic for a semester this past fall. I loved it. I went to Laredo in November of last year.
I'm Jeremy Williams, a 3L from Savannah, Georgia. I was in the clinic last fall semester, and I went to Laredo the week before last Christmas.
All right, thank you all. And Anna, so I will I'm going to give a little bit more background about the project, and then I'll ask Anna to talk a little bit about how this partnership with Jones Day formed. So the Laredo Project, again, run by Jones Day and TRLA, provides free legal representation to women who are detained by ICE at the Texas border. So these are women who cross the border and are either apprehended at the border or turn themselves in. And sometimes it's women who have been living in the United States for a long period of time but sort of went undetected and are then apprehended by ICE. So ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's like alphabet soup, right, in a lot of the legal world, and the same goes for immigration. So ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so these women are brought to the Laredo Processing Center, which is a detention facility. It's a federal immigration detention facility. And Jones Day started this project where they go into the detention facility and they screen women for representation. If a woman has a colorable asylum claim, so they're fleeing from persecution in their home country, Jones Day provides free representation to them. So a Jones Day attorney takes the case on pro bono and represents them throughout their asylum proceeding. So Jones Day also conducts Know Your Rights presentations within the detention facility. So the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic has started this partnership where our student attorneys have the opportunity to travel to Laredo for a week at a time, and we get to act as the sort of immigration experts, which is really quite amazing. So most of the Jones Day attorneys who volunteer for this project have no prior immigration experience. This is their first exposure to immigration and asylum law. And so we get to go down and show off the expertise we've gained in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, which is pretty great. So I'll ask Anna to talk a little bit about how this partnership started.
So it's really a continuation of work we've been doing for the last couple of years. In 2014, we were seeing in the United States an influx of women and children coming up on our southern border. And in response to that, the Obama administration was placing these women and their children in jails around the country. And they're placed in jails that were in very remote locations. So Artesia, New Mexico is one of those, and it's 4 hours from the nearest city of Albuquerque. So recognizing that many of these women were fleeing, it was a refugee crisis. They're fleeing incredible violence in Central America. advocates from around the country, including clinicians, were chatting about how can we gain access to these women and children, how can we help them get out of jail so that they can advocate for themselves or find attorneys to advocate for them in the asylum process. And so through that, I sent 2 students, the first attorneys from Maine, I think the only ones at that time, traveling to these detention facilities, and they traveled for a week each to assist in representation of these women. In 2017, again, we're seeing an influx of women and children coming across our border. And I had Nora Bosworth working with me over last summer, in 2017 summer, and we chatted about how can we help and continue to help with these issues. And so I made some calls through various connections I had in Texas, and I actually placed a cold call after I learned from a clinician that Jones Day had this project. And so I got online and contacted the head of the firm's pro bono, all of their pro bono initiatives, and she answered, or maybe she called me back. And I told her about how fantastic Nora is and how I think it would be fantastic if she could go and assist. And she said, great, we'll pay for her way and she can come. And so Nora went, and that really paved the way for this partnership. They were blown away by Nora's work. I sent then Greta Lozada in August of that same summer. And after that, they said, we would love for this partnership to continue. And so from then on out, every student who participates in the clinic has been able to go for a week-long increment to Laredo. We are the only law school in the country that they're collaborating with. And so it's quite an amazing opportunity for the students.
Thank you. So next, I will ask each of our student panelists to just talk, sort of give a brief description of the weeks you were there, the kind of work you were doing, and just sort of what the experience was like. Go ahead, Nora.
So the night you get there, you have an orientation dinner. You usually get there on a Sunday. And then on Monday, the way that they structure the rest of their week is they have what they call a Know Your Rights training within the detention center, which isn't so much a Know Your Rights training as this is who we are and this is how we can help you, and a little brief overview of the asylum process. And all the women who attend that event, if they're interested in being assessed for asylum to see if they can be clients of Jones Day and CLRA, will write down their name, and those names that you get that first night will be the people who you'll try to see throughout the entire week. And sometimes there are too many names to possibly see all of them, but that's the goal. And then the meat of your day is getting into the actual attorney-client rooms. There are only 2 in the detention center, so sometimes there's hours of waiting in the waiting room for various crazy reasons. But basically there's an access to counsel problem because of the way they've structured the attorney-client rooms. And then once you are in there, you're sort of having back-to-back very intense intake interviews of trying to get these women's stories. And sometimes you can tell pretty soon into the interview that they probably don't have any grounds for asylum, and then you wrap it up. But usually the interviews take up to 2 or even longer hours because you really don't know where their story is going to go. And at the end of the day, you return to the hotel, which is sort of their base, and you write up memos. I don't know what that was. You write up memos sort of detailing the interviews and the claims and giving your opinion on things like credibility and strength of the claim and suggestions on what type of asylum they would be seeking. So based on, political opinion or what.
Yeah, just to add on to that, because Nora did a really great job explaining the work that we did down there. So you're in this detention center, which I think we'll talk more about what that structure is like, but we're in this detention center every single day for the entire day, meeting with as many women as we possibly can. But like Nora said, it's impossible to make it through the list of women that they give you every single day, which probably has 8 names on it or so. You're lucky if you make it to 4, because these intakes are a very lengthy process, and you're trying, just like Nora said, to get as much information as you possibly can, working with an individual who has gone through some intense trauma. So more often than not, they are very emotional in these intake interviews. So it takes time to be able to elicit information from these women.
The only thing I would add is that, so for the first half of the week is when we're doing these interviews, usually on Thursday and Friday, when we have to do the determination, whether
Pull the mic.
There we go. So the first week, part of the week, you're meeting with these women to evaluate their claims. But then on Thursday and Friday, you have to meet with them again, and you have to explain to them, in my situation, why we weren't taking any of the cases and why they didn't qualify for asylum, and talk to them about what their options were moving forward, and just give them a little bit of understanding of their situation and how they fit into this legal situation. And so, you know, it's just a very different experience from the first half of the week to the last half of the week.
Yeah, just to kind of add on that, the toughest part was, you know, we did 6 interviews a day, my partner and I, the Jones Day partner I worked with, and it's very rare that you have a solid asylum case. And the Jones Day guys tell you that, you know, if it looks like it's not a good case, go ahead and move forward. So you were constantly having to tell us. They'd tell this horrific story, but it didn't fit the elements perfect. So you're constantly having to tell someone that although they're big time danger going back and their life is awful, it just didn't meet the asylum requirements. So you had to do that 6, 7, 8 times a day. So.
Yeah. Do you want to, you mentioned just maybe a little bit more context about the detention facility and what that looks like, Joanne, since you sort of touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, so if you think of any jail or prison, you know, just like what you've seen on TV or a movie or whatever, the detention center is exactly that. It is just a concrete structure. I think today we were talking about Laredo, and someone described it as a demented elementary school, which I think is a very accurate description because it's concrete, you know, cylinder, you know, or concrete walls. The floor is very bare. The women are in jumpsuits. It's very cold in the detention center, and they do that on purpose. And women are wearing these very thin jumpsuits, and so we were told, as volunteers, bring a sweater, bring a scarf, because it's freezing in there. And Hani, who's another student in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, met with a girl who her teeth were chattering. She was so cold. And one of the Jones Day attorneys let her wear her coat during that intake. So it's not a happy place at all. It's a very bleak place to be in.
Yeah. And I wonder if one of you might be willing to sort of just talk a little bit about the kinds of things that these women have experienced. So things that they're fleeing from, sort of the kinds of stories that we hear a lot when we're in there doing these intakes. Whoever sort of feels comfortable sharing that. Go ahead.
One story that I kept hearing again and again this last time I went were women who had been coerced into sexual relationships with gang members. And I don't to say that they were girlfriends is sort of pushing that word, but they were coerced into, sometimes they were kidnapped from high school and then sort of trapped in a house and forced to be the sexual partner of a gang member, and sometimes they were taken at gunpoint to visit gang members who were already in prison and then raped repeatedly in these visits. So I guess, what do we call them? Conjugal visits?
Yeah.
So the prison guards would sort of turn a blind eye. But essentially, I mean, I guess I would use the word sex slaves, right? And they endured a lot of, obviously, sexual violence and a lot of really, really horrible other types of physical violence. And they were escaping these relationships and felt like they couldn't leave the relationship beyond the fact that it was beyond all the reasons that one doesn't leave a typical domestic violence relationship. They also couldn't leave because the gang had power all throughout the country. And so it was this sort of double trap.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
I also saw quite a bit of gang violence. So there was a few of the situations that Nora described, but also many women who had witnessed a crime by a gang member, and then there was gang came after them, or especially their families, or if a woman tried to prevent the gang from recruiting a brother or a husband or any relative that was not tolerated by gang members, and so incredible violence following that. That was the bulk of the cases I.
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. One that stands out of mind is we had one where there was a there was a gang in town, and they would film these women in compromising situations, sexual situations, and then use that film as blackmail to keep them in that situation. So we had one female who that's why she fled, because her whole town, she was afraid that the video was going to get out and her family would know. So that's why and if she went back, she's going to have hell to pay if she.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and I think someone touched upon the fact that, so we're doing these, we said the word sort of intake interview several times, and so what that means is, again, we are going in and conducting a preliminary interview with this potential client to see if we think that they fit within the statutory requirements for asylum, which are very specific. And so a lot of people don't know that to sort of be eligible for asylum, you really have to prove that you have experienced persecution and for a very particular reason. And so it's very challenging because you're going in, you're hearing these very compelling stories from women who have been through so much, both in their home countries and on their journey to the United States, often is incredibly perilous. And it's a really difficult role to have to be the one who's evaluating that claim. And you just want to say yes to everyone. We're going to represent you and we're going to help you. And we can. And so that can be really difficult. So next, I want to ask you each, if you can, to address sort of how your work in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic prepared you for the experience of traveling to Laredo. Go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, I think in 1,000 ways, but I think primarily we spend a lot of time in clinic, talking about navigating this balance with your client of navigating their trauma while completing your legal agenda, while still connecting as a human with this person and building trust, because it takes a lot of trust to share the most traumatic experiences you've had, which unfortunately is necessary in an asylum case. So I think having had experience in that kind of juggling act of staying human while having legal goals, while being prepared for all the insanity that comes with people recounting the worst memories of their lives, made me go into those meetings with far more confidence than I would have otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, just like Nora said, there are a lot of things that we've learned in the clinic that, we have, or at least when I was in Laredo, came in handy a lot. I think for me, the biggest thing is this client, building rapport with a client, which is one of the first things that you learn in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic. And I think that's a very important part, especially where we're going into a situation where these women have gone through some pretty emotional things. And while you are there to gather as many facts as possible, that is still a human being sitting across the table from you. And you can't just dive in and say, tell me the worst thing that happened to you right now. That's not going to be effective to get the information that you need. And it's going to probably re-traumatize that woman. So for me, building rapport with the women was very important. And it was very interesting because for a lot of the Jones Day attorneys, they have limited experience working with trauma victims. And so it was really up to us to be able to bring that sort of human side, I guess, to the client interview.
I agree with everything that they said. When I was thinking about this question, I thought that the clinic prepared me because it gave me the practical skills I needed to be able to navigate this traumatic week. And I think most of all, I was familiar with the immigration system and with the immigration laws that apply, and that was so valuable because we got into these interviews and sometimes I was the only one who had a background, other than the crash course that they provide, in immigration law. And one of the hardest things is to, like both have been saying, be emotionally engaged and yet to find what you need from a legal situation viewpoint. And so being able to remain objective despite what's going on while still being compassionate is a skill that I think that the clinic really helped me develop.
Yeah, nothing much to add on that. Just an example. My first day, the guy they paired me up with was a Jones Day partner who worked in IP. He literally sat down and just went down the checklist and very, black and white, went down the list. And the client was, or the potential client was almost in tears. And I had to say, slow down, just take a second, take a breath. And that kind of really helps. And the second day he was, I think he really took it to heart because then he was a lot more slow and didn't do like a checklist.
Certainly. Yeah, I would definitely, I think it's important to emphasize that, right? So I said at the beginning that we're, right, one of our roles there is to be sort of the asylum experts, where that's a large part of our practice in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic. But the clinic is really a holistic experience, and we do a lot of training around working with trauma victims, right? We meet with a licensed clinical social worker, and we do counseling on secondary trauma, so how we ourselves can process the traumatic experiences that we're encountering. And so it really is not only the knowledge you gain in the clinic, but also the skills that you develop through those trainings that really come in handy. So I absolutely agree. Okay, so I think next would be to ask you all what the most rewarding part of your experience in Laredo was. Let's start with Jeremy this time. We'll mix it up.
Nice. So looking at this question, it's kind of hard to say rewarding when it's such a bad experience for the other people there. You don't want to kind of, I got all this, I'm doing great. So I think a better way to look at it is what I sort of got to see firsthand. You read about this in immigration class or in the, every day if you're watching the news and it doesn't quite hit home and it's actually worse than what you see on the news. So you get to see it firsthand, and just a little example of this. So I noticed you sit in the lobby forever some days, sometimes 3 or 4 hours, and you notice it's a private company that runs this detention center. So the guys working there are local Laredo citizens. Laredo is basically an extension of Mexico, if you've ever been there. So these guys who were working there that had to do this work, obviously they needed the job. They had to sort of police these people who were just like them, and you knew they had families. So you could just tell it was kind of a lot of sunken heads and a lot of just doing the work because they needed the money, and it was just it was sort of demoralizing, it looked like, for them. So
So the opportunity to travel down to Laredo was such a meaningful experience for me, and I think that, like Jeremy said, just being more aware of the situation and the realities of how immigration law, we can talk about it in theory and we can talk about it from a policy perspective, but seeing its effect on the individual was so powerful. And understanding the motivations of these women was so powerful. And it was interesting because I really did not look forward to having to tell these women, I'm sorry, we can't take your case, and this is why. But I found that those interactions were some of the most meaningful interactions, because these women are, if you put yourself in their situation to whatever degree you can, these women are in the situation and they have no understanding of what's going on, and they're in a very hostile environment. And so they all of them, even though they were, upset that we couldn't help them, they all thanked me that they had at least some clarity. And so seeing their grace and their ability to express gratitude despite their circumstances was so powerful, and it really made the experience so valuable. So that's what I would have to say.
I'm going to say the opposite of that and say the most rewarding experience, or part of the experience, was telling someone that we are taking your case. And I was able to do that with my group a couple times. Unfortunately, it was only a couple of times throughout the entire week, but when we were able to, it was just an incredible feeling for us to be able to present that news. And, the women were incredibly grateful and just so relieved that, I guess all of the trauma that they went through to get to the U.S. kind of paid off for now, unfortunately, but
yeah, I took the question more as Jeremy did in terms of what did I take away And I agree that there's something just invaluable about being down there and seeing and hearing these stories and seeing the conditions of these people who have crossed the border in this detention center. And I mean, there's a geographical distinction to the work down there than what we do here, because most of the clients that we have at the clinic are coming from Africa or from the Middle East, and they're flying here and overstaying visas, whereas the view you have from the hotel room that you are working on in Laredo is that. You're staring at a bridge that crosses the Rio Grande, and like the day before I got there, they had seen someone swimming across the river. And I think it impressed on me, I think hearing all these stories from the women impressed on me the enormity of the like systemic issues that they are fleeing. And you know, if from countries like El Salvador, one of the questions we had to ask in assessing their case was, okay, well, you couldn't be in this town, but was there anywhere else you could go to escape the gang? And a lot of them would just laugh because the country is so completely dominated by these gangs. And understanding like the sheer desperation that it takes to make what is almost without fail an incredibly dangerous journey was very valuable.
Can I just add something real quick? So, not all the women that are detained in that facility are new arrivals. So there were a couple women that my group had met with, were women who had lived in the United States for 10 years or longer. And there was one woman who had gone out on New Year's Eve with her husband just to like go for an innocent drive. I think it was like that afternoon, New Year's Day. Sorry, not New Year's Eve. New Year's Day. Her husband was like, let's go out for a drive. And she said, okay, let's go. And they got to an intersection. And when they normally would have taken like, say, a left turn, they're like, today we'll take a right. And they drove right into an immigration checkpoint. Both were undocumented. Both got were immediately detained and brought to the detention center. And they have children who are in school, who are now living with the wife's, the mother's family in Dallas. And so it's not just women who are new to the United States. These are women who have been part of our country for 10 years or more and who have established the lives here. So I think those were incredibly heartbreaking stories as well.
Absolutely. I think, you know, for all of us in the Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, we get to have an incredible connection with a lot of our clients, and that human connection is a really a big piece of why I love this area of the law and why I love this work. But it's really difficult to, I mean, certainly, right, immigration is a contentious topic. It's in the news a lot. But when you are sitting across the table from a human being and hearing their story, that's just a really powerful experience. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that if there are people in the audience who have questions, we would love to have a couple of people ask questions. If not, I have more that I can ask. But does anyone in the audience want to ask a question of the panel? Yeah.
You mentioned that children were at the detention center as well. Is that correct? It was just women.
It was men and women at this detention center.
I had mentioned in 2014, the students went to a family detention center. So there are family detention centers around the country as well. But this one is for women and men, adults.
Are the situations the same, the environment the same in a family detention center?
No.
So the family detention centers in Artesia, it was actually looked worse. I didn't go. The students actually blogged about it, and you can just Google Maine law students Artesia and read their story. It was also written up in the Portland Press Herald. But there, it wasn't a center that was designed for children. They've since closed that facility down, and they've opened 2 family detention centers, one in Dilley and one in Karnes, Texas, which for all intents and purposes are still jails, but there are certain rooms, maybe a rec room or other rooms that are meant for children, but they look like jails. It feels like a jail. And this, yeah.
Can I pay?
Yes.
So one of the women who I met with arrives, instead of trying to come across the river. She arrived at the border and presented herself and asked and said, I have fear, and asked for asylum. And she presented herself with her 10-month-old son, expecting to be taken to a family detention center like the mothers in front of her in the line, who she saw shipped off to family detention centers. And ICE approached her and took away her 10-month-old son, kicking and screaming while she was shouting, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" and sent her to Laredo, separated from her child. She had no idea where her child was, and there's no legal certainty that she will ever even see that child again. And this is something that, so talk about, takeaways. This is something that I had no idea was happening, and I'm at least more inserted in that world than most people, so I imagine that the vast majority of the country doesn't know it's happening. But yeah, one of the policies now is to try to disincentivize people from coming by separating parents from their young children. And so they're not all winding up at family detention centers.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So, you started out by saying that the detention centers were very isolated and rural. Did something change that started to get these women out of those isolated ones and go to Laredo, or how did something different happen?
No, most of our detention, we have about 200 plus detention facilities around the country, and most are in rural areas, and that's intentional. But they've started moving them, as many as they can, closer to the border to get them fast-tracked out.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So how many of these women do you think are actually, could be lying to you about their situation? That really they're economic immigrants, but you cannot get immigration status by being an economic immigrant. I would imagine some of these people at least have learned what they need to say when they get to this country to try to get legal status. So I'm just curious how you...
Yeah, I will say a lot of the women who I personally interviewed told us that they were here for economic reasons. So you get a lot of that, and we would say to them, we're really sorry, you don't have a claim for asylum. And then we would advise them about their rights at that point in the process. So I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that.
Just very briefly, I think that definitely happens. But and in working with the clinic and like other previous experiences that I've had prior to law school, I've met with a lot of people before, and the women that I met in Laredo, I never got the sense that any of them were misrepresenting what had happened to them. The stories were just way too detailed and the women were just way too emotional, and I just don't think you can really fake that kind of emotion.
So when I was there, there was a Johanna that runs the Jones Day Project. She's really good at what she does. We actually had a sort of a pre-training about. There was a woman in Arizona who was trying to run these little. It was a racket where she would kind of give people down in Central and South America the knowledge and just say this and you'll get in. They sniffed that out in a second. The Jones Day was really good about that. Again, we had a training before the training about that. But also, like was mentioned earlier, if they're coming for an economic reason, they'll tell you. We had probably, if you have 12 people you interview, you'll hear 7 or 8 of those say, I wanted an education, I wanted a better economic life. They'll tell you pretty quickly. So it's pretty rare that actually happens, I would say.
So I'm sorry, I should have, well, we have time for one more.
After your time in Laredo, you went back. Have you had any follow-on contact with the Jones Day lawyers who are taking the cases for asylum that you worked on?
Actually, I will say, Connie, who's right there, we went down to Laredo together, and she was on a team that involved one partner and one associate, and then another individual who was somehow related to Jones Day. So the associate was able to take on an asylum case of a woman that they had done an intake with that week, and she's currently working on the case. So Ani does keep in contact with that attorney. So that's nice to have some sort of, closure, I guess.
I apologize for not leaving more time for questions. We will all be out at the reception afterwards if you would like to speak with us individually. I'm just going to ask Anna to sort of wrap up, sort of from our supervisor's perspective, sort of the value of this project and any closing remarks you might have.
Hey, so I think I can encapsulate my feelings on this through this call I received a couple of weeks ago. So Laura is the head of, for all of the Jones Day's pro bono work, and it's hundreds of attorneys and dozens of offices around the country and world. And she gave me a call, well, she sent me an email on my work email saying at 7:30 at night saying, can you please call my cell? Like, oh God, what happened? It's a Thursday night. Why is she saying this? So I call her quickly on her cell, and she's like, I just want you to know, I just left a meeting with one of your students and a partner she's working with. They're preparing for this big trial in defensive asylum case. It's tomorrow. We have no idea how it's going to go, but the last few days, she's been working with this partner, and it started with a team with this partner, your student, and several other associates. And as they've gotten closer to the hearing date, the partner says, I don't want to work with anyone else. I only want to work with this individual. And she said, this partner not only doesn't know that she's not a licensed attorney yet, she actually thinks she's a partner in one of our other offices. And I haven't even told her yet that she's a Maine law student, because I just think it's so fascinating, so wonderful to have your students here. And she just reiterated how incredibly grateful they have been for the expertise and the warmth and compassion and empathy of Maine law students, how universally the partners and associates are just so incredibly impressed and viewing them as experts. And so for me, I'm just so proud of the work they're doing. That one student has actually turned this opportunity into a full-time externship this semester. So such passion that she comes back with it. Now she's working there full-time and gaining amazing experience and connection, certainly, to this international law firm. So it's been a great partnership.
All right. Thank you all again for joining us for the panel. And again, we'll see you outside.